part 3 then are trends in U.S.-bound migration. And here what I want to do is start with this chart, which is, it's a little dated already because this is from the year 2000, but these are the percentage of foreign-born from Mexico in the United States at the year 2000. And what the legend tells us is that this darkest red that's here, these are places where the foreign-born, those are people born in Mexico living in the United States, is above 20% of the population, 20 to, in fact, 37% of the population in those counties. In these counties that are the darkest red are, in fact, people who are foreign-born living in those places. Overall, the average is very low, actually. It's only 3.7% foreign-born. But you can see that it concentrates. And, of course, it concentrates along that border between Mexico and the United States, and then in very specific destinations that over time have increased populations, Mexican populations, Chicago, the North Carolina, and this is largely for the poultry industry. Southern Florida, this is largely a movement of people into into Native American communities for security, and then again all along the border and along the West Coast. Okay, but this is again from 2000. It has increased into 2010. Unfortunately, I was looking for a 2010 version of this from the 2010 census, but I couldn't find one, so I apologize for that. So I have the 2005. Okay, so some of the issues that face us when dealing with migration between Latin America and the U.S. Now, one of the things that we think a lot about is border crossing between Mexico and the U.S., because this is the issue that really captures our attention most. But there is migration into the U.S. through airports. There is migration into the U.S. through other borders. And there's lots of different kinds of movements. But of the approximately, so this is stuff that comes from a few years ago, but of the approximately 11,000 Border Patrol agents, 89%, so almost, the vast majority of them, are working along the U.S.-Mexican border, managing that border, policing that border. And in 2004, there were over 1 million apprehensions on that border. In 2005, there were 473 deaths along with those apprehensions, and in Arizona alone, there were over 260. So this is a very tense, very difficult subject to talk about. It's a hard thing to understand. It, I think, suggests just how dire some of the situations are that people will continue to cross this border. But it also is part of the story of how the border has changed. In the 1990s, when I would talk to migrants, they would talk about crossing the U.S.-Mexican border in ways that were almost like a cat and mouse kind of a game, where they would say, well, I'd get to the border, I'd call my brother, I'd call my cousin, they'd come and get me, and if I got caught, well, I would just wait for another day. Today, or in the present day, it's a much tenser sort of relationship where people who even have experiences in the United States will say things like, well, I got to the border and I had to find somebody who would act as a coyote, a smuggler. I had to pay him somewhere between $2,000 and $10,000 to get myself across the border, creating a very, very different, very tenser, very very uncomfortable kind of a relationship that carries with it costs. Because if you have a smuggler that you have to pay, the first thing you have to do now in the United States is to pay off that smuggler, to earn that money to pay off that smuggler. And that's very different than saying, I'm going to call my cousin, they're going to take me across the border, I'm going to go to the job that I've always had, and that money is going to go to take care of me in the United States, and then the percentage, the little bit of percentage, usually is about 20% of my income that's left, that is what I will share with my family back in Mexico. Okay? And then this just calls, this part, there's a thing called the Secure Border Initiative that's managed by the Department of Homeland Security. and it's bringing new technologies. This is the stuff that we hear a lot about, the new technologies to the border and to apprehensions on the border. Okay. Now, beyond the border, beyond thinking about what that border is and movement around that border, two of the issues beyond the border and beyond thinking about the border and beyond issues that really complicate border crossing, there's a question of what should we do, what should we think about migration? Is migration a positive? Is migration a negative? Okay. Is it a benefit to U.S. society? Is it a detriment to U.S. society? Are the presence of Mexicans in the U.S. problematic? Is the presence of Peruvians, Brazilians, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Costa Ricans, and, say, people from the Caribbean, are these benefits? Are these opportunities for us? Well, as you might expect, depending on where you want to sit in this debate, you can say that migration is a positive, and you can say, yes, we do need migrants, or you can say migration is a negative, and it's something that we should avoid. So as we talk about the opportunities and problems that face us in terms of migrants in the United States, of Latin American migrants in the United States, rather than saying there is a one answer, I want to give you some of the factors that influence people to argue for migration, for opportunity, and some of the factors that potentially argue against migration. What I don't want to do is create a moral argument that says we should support migration because it's just a good thing, okay? Because it's a morally upright thing to do. I would agree with that, but that's not necessarily a good argument, okay? So you can be for or against migration, but I think knowing the facts is one of the best ways to get to that place and to begin to think about your sense of migration. Okay? And what I'd ask you to do is to not think about the migration issue and the presence or absence of migrants in the United States as something based on, say, thinking that migrants are criminals, or if migrants are undocumented, then they shouldn't be in the United States, okay? Or that all migrants are somehow or another linked, or the majority of them are linked to drugs. Okay? First, one of the things to remember is that migration is a very expensive process. It's very costly, and it's very difficult, and so people do not necessarily migrate because it's a very hard thing to do. It's a very costly thing to do. Second, it's really important to remember that when people decide to migrate, what they're deciding is to cross for all those push and pull reasons and even more things that we've talked about already. And they are not necessarily thinking about what the challenge is in a legal sense. Okay? They're thinking about what the issues are from the perspective of, I live in a very poor, very where opportunities are very limited, and I want to go and find those opportunities. I want to take care of my families. And this is also something that I just want to emphasize, is that migration, the decision to migrate, while it is made by a person, I decide I'm the person who's going to potentially cross the border, or I'm going to go to Cancun, or I'm going to go to Brazil. It's a decision that I make, but the decision that I make is also informed by all the people around me, my family, my education, my experiences, the opportunities, the people that I know at that point of destination. So it's a very, very complex issue, and one that we don't necessarily always have the right answers for. But there are, I think, factors that are very positive that would argue for opening the borders, and there are things that are far more problematic, and these are things that you can take home, think about in processing these ideas for yourself. So let's start with some of the positives that are going to influence some of these outcomes and should argue for potentially developing reforms that are a little bit more welcoming. And remembering in this process that nearly all of us here in the United States can trace ourselves back within just a few generations to somebody living not in the United States, but from a foreign country, which always reminds me of a very funny story with my patron, the man that my wife and I lived with when we were doing research about 20 years ago. One day and one afternoon we were talking about migration, and he looked at me and he said, "Mira, hombre," he said, look at this, man. He said, "Gringo," he said, "you're the only mojado in the room," right? He said, "I lived here all my life. My ancestors are from this place," right? He said, "You're the only mojado." It's a very kind of nasty, negative term, a wetback, okay? He said, "You're the only wetback in the room, man." Okay, so and we laughed pretty hard about that, but he was right. My story of migration to the United States, my family story, is a far more recent story than anything his family has done. Okay, he's never crossed a border like that. So anyway, let me give you some of the positives that would argue for being more welcoming of migrants, of pushing towards reforms. Okay, first of all, migrants are typically going to take jobs that are menial or low paying. Or at least we're going to see them as menial and low paying. They are jobs that are, in a sense, what maybe we used to call starter jobs. And these are the jobs that are sometimes very hard to fill. Okay? They may be in restaurants. They're usually in service of some kind. They may be domestic. But in all these instances, they're not paying the kinds of wages that perhaps we would expect with the educations that we have, with the opportunities that we expect to encounter. And so immigrants are going to take those kinds of jobs. A lot of these jobs are growing in healthcare fields, for example. These are people who are going to come in to take care of us as we get older. So these are important people to have around. The fact that the pay is low is very problematic. We should be paying living wages. At the same time, those living wages in relationship to the wages that are that exist in origin communities can be just incredibly high. Okay, so you may come to the United States and take what we see as a very low wage work, but still earning a living wage, and you may make 10 times what you could have made at home. Okay? Now that doesn't mean that 10 times the money is going back. Somewhere in the order of 80% of every dollar earned in the United States stays in the United States. It stays to cover all the expenses associated with living in the United States. But the rest of that money will go home, and it will still be very helpful to the non-migrants who are there. Okay? And this brings us to the second point, that the immigrant spends money on products and services that correlate with economic growth. So everything that the immigrant does in the United States is something that is going to support growth in the United States. Paying for utilities, paying for entertainment, paying for food, paying for rent, paying for transportation. These are things that are very important. The money that goes into things like Social Security, for example, is critically important to taking care of all of us. Okay? Immigrants generally do not cause the economic crises that we encounter. These are people who are employed generally in very low wage, low status sorts of jobs. These are not the jobs that are going to create economic complications for a country. These are not the jobs that are going to push us into recession, push us into depression, or create drains on opportunities. Okay? And tying into this, that immigrants are not causing economic problems for us or crises, is that generally immigrants are not eligible for assistance. So they are not people who are coming in specifically to say, oh, I'll cross the border to the United States to access assistance. And this is one of the myths that migrants come in to access assistance. That just does not happen. You can, of course, find the examples, but those are very particular examples. You can find somebody who will tell you that, I came across because I needed health care or something. That's generally not what goes on. And one of the reasons why we know that is that it is very difficult to migrate. It's a very expensive, very costly, very difficult process. And if you are not healthy, it's that much harder. You probably are not, in fact, going to make cross the border. Okay? So this brings us to the next point, which are immigrants are typically young and very healthy. So they're in the prime of their lives. They are working hard, and they are very much beneficial to the overall health of our economy. They are not drains on the economy. Okay? Now, if we were to legalize the status of immigrants in the United States, if we had, say, opportunities for access that did not necessarily criminalize somebody for simply crossing the border, what we would find is that it might be much easier to enforce status rules and to collect taxes, okay? Because these people would not be working under the table or behind closed doors, but in the open where they would have to pay the kinds of federal, state, and local taxes that all workers are involved in paying. Okay? So that might be an opportunity. Okay? And then finally, and this brings us back to the whole issue of healthcare, immigrants provide additional residence for a country to help support aging native populations. And this goes beyond simply supporting aging native populations. It goes to rebuilding communities that have been really challenged, say challenged here in the United States by their own forms of migration. We know that there are cities across the eastern part of the United States where we see a massive flow of people as they get older to the south and to the west. Replacing those populations becomes really important. Encouraging immigrants to settle is one of those ways that you replace that population. Pittsburgh has a very aggressive program encouraging people to come and move into a community. This can be the way in which a community really pushes aside issues of decline because it's replacing population rather than just trying to encourage people to stay. It's actually attracting people. So these are just some of the factors that can really encourage or enhance or be positive when we're thinking about migrants. Now, are there alternatives? Are there negatives? Yes, there are. I don't want to argue that it is one or the other. There are positives and negatives. Okay? There is the argument that immigrants are going to take jobs from U.S. citizens. Generally, this does not happen, although there are issues where people say that this can become a problem. There are people that will tell you that immigrants are going to push down wages. And this can happen particularly where immigrants are not given any kind of legal status, whether they are in the country with documentation or not. If they are not given any kind of status, that can in fact push down wages. And it can lead to all kinds of abuses of those wages. Okay? Immigrants may in fact access welfare states for aid and support. If not them, then their children. So one of the factors that we do run into is that immigrants who settle in the United States, who start their families in the United States, have children that then need education. But if we think about this in terms of economic growth rather than a challenge, okay, what we're doing is we're creating citizens through time. So it is in fact a challenge, but it is a challenge that managed correctly can be quite positive. Okay? Immigrants replace American traditions and practices with local beliefs and practices. Okay? We have celebrations of Cinco de Mayo in Columbus and in most parts of the United States. Those are not, in fact, Latin American or Mexican celebrations as much as they are celebrations by the manufacturers of alcoholic drinks. So, again, this can be a challenge, but a problematic one. Okay? And then, so here's the drain on school resources. Finally, what I want to talk about is this issue that immigrants may fail to assimilate or may create a kind of a brain drain. That is, one of the things is you have immigrants in the United States that refuse to participate in the life of our country. Again, I would argue that building walls to limit populations encourage that failure rather than encouraging assimilation. And brain drain, which is immigrants creating, really leaving opportunities in their sending countries. That is a challenge, but it's a challenge that, again, through time can change, in part because we know that migrants will tend to return to their places of origin, or sometimes their children or grandchildren, and they return with resources and with expectations that are new. And so the flows, those transnational flows that we talked about a little earlier, then become a real program or a real process through which things like brain drain become far less of a challenge. So while all of these are challenges, all of these are reasons to problematize migration into the United States from Latin America, these are also things that I think we can develop answers for. Finally, this last piece, what I want to share with you, is the ways in which migration has changed. So if we look at 1990 to the present, one of the things that you'll see is this just absolutely skyrocketing or pretty massive increase in the numbers of migrants without documentation living in the United States, from something about 3.5 million in 1990 to about 12.2 million in 2000, or just before 2007. What is interesting is that following the global economic crisis, that migration to the United States, the entrance of undocumented or unauthorized immigrants to the United States, largely from Latin America, largely from Mexico, declines pretty rapidly. And this actually shows here specifically looking at apprehensions of unauthorized immigrants from 1995 to 2002 from Mexico. And you see that it drops very rapidly into the present. Now, we know that migration is beginning to pick up again between places like Mexico and the United States because the economy, our economy, is getting stronger again, and Mexico's economy has continued to struggle. But these are changes that are playing out in interesting ways. There are smaller populations crossing the U.S. The economic argument, I think, is important. The second part of the argument that's not really talked about as much is the fact that migration, as I've said, is defined by all these push and pull factors. There's also a great importance to what we might call inertia, to just staying where you were born, okay? Staying in that place. There's a great kind of weight that says, this is my home. And people don't necessarily migrate. And we shouldn't be surprised that there is a decline. And part of that decline may be that we have just hit a point at which migration is not going to continue to grow because the people who want to migrate, who can migrate, who were encouraged to migrate, most of them have, in fact, migrated. And people who do not want to migrate are not taking their place. So there's that sort of change.